A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon, Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
In our previous interview, we were discussing correct pronunciation of Hebrew. Can the Rabbi please continue to explain the consonantal sounds of our ancestral language?
Kaph has two forms. It is one of the 7 letters with 2 pronunciations, known as the Sheva Kefuloth, depending on whether it has a daresh or not. A Kaph with a daresh, with a dot in the middle, is the simple and well-known sound of a k, like a k in English. And the Kaph without a dot, but known as a Kaph refuya, or a soft Kaph, is a ch, the same sound, but softened. Keep in mind that all the letters with the 2 pronunciations, depending on the presence or absence of a dagesh, both sounds emanate from the same area of the mouth and throat, etc. And therefore the k and the ch, you will note, also follow this rule. They come from the same point at the back of the mouth, near the throat. So k and ch, these are 2 well-known sounds, and all the different edot, all the different groups and customs within the Jewish people are familiar with this sound and pronounce it in this manner. And therefore we can move on to the next letter, which is lamed. Lamed is a straightforward sound of an L in English, and again it is known and pronounced by all parts of the Jewish people, apparently without exception, going back to ancient times, and therefore again nothing much to say beyond that. Mem and Nun and Samach are the same, in that they are all letters with 1 pronunciation. They are not one of those 7 double letters with a double pronunciation. And they're also well known and understood and pronounced correctly by all the Jewish people. The Mem is the sound of an M in English, and the Nun is the sound of an N in English, and the Samach is the sound of an S in English. And again, nothing much needs to be added, and therefore we can move on to the next letter, which is already a different story. The following letter, after Samach, is an Ain. The letter Ain does not exist in European languages, which is why the Ashkenazim over time lost the ability to pronounce it correctly. I might point out that apart from clearly being a Semitic consonant, it exists, of course, the Ain exists, of course, in Arabic and in Aramaic, etc. It also exists in Chinese and some other Asian languages. I'm not an expert, I don't claim to be an expert in Chinese, but I do know that an Ain sound exists in the Chinese language. So it is not as unique, perhaps, as some people imagine, this sound in human speech. And is it slightly difficult to describe how to produce this sound? One has to hear people actually say it. If we take the word for the number 70 in Hebrew, if we were to pronounce it without the Ain, then we would say, as many people do, they say Shivim. Shivim meaning 70. Sheva is 7, Shivim, they pronounce, that is how they pronounce the word for 70. But when pronounced correctly, the word for 7 in Hebrew is Sheva, and the word for 70 is Shivim. And this is a sound which is familiar nowadays, I would say, to all Jews in Israel. And it's interesting to note that there are many Ashkenazim, even Ashkenazim of a Haredi persuasion, who pronounce the Ain to a greater or lesser extent, particularly during prayer. They make an effort to do so, particularly perhaps during Kriyat Shema more than other times, because they know of the importance of pronouncing the words of Kriyat Shema correctly. At any rate, it is all a question of acclimatization, of having heard it and being aware of such a sound, having heard others do it, and thus being able to pick it up. This, of course, is how all human beings learn and pick up language. Another example of the letter Ayn is the name of our forefather, of course, Yaakov. Some Jews not familiar with the Ayn sound say Yaakov and pronounce the Ayn as an aleph, as it were. But it's interesting to note that even amongst the Ashkenazim, historically, and you can still find this with some people, with the pronunciation of some people today, many Ashkenazim pronounce the name Yaakov, which they couldn't pronounce correctly, as Yankov, with an N or Nun sound somehow interpolated into the middle of the word. And that Nun is a kind of fossil remain of the Ayn, because very often Ayn, which is a deep sound, when people try to pronounce it without success, they end up pronouncing a kind of Nun sound. So the pronunciation Yankov or Yankov is actually an indication, a proof that once upon a time even Ashkenazim knew how to say Yaakov. And this, of course, is also borne out by the term used as a nickname for a person whose name is Yaakov, and that is Yankel. The same explanation holds true here as well. So that with regards to the letter Ayn. After the Ayn, of course, we have the Peh. The Peh is one of those 7 letters which has 2 pronunciations. The Peh de Rusha, the Peh with the dot in the middle, is a P, like the letter P in the Latin alphabet. And without a dot, the Peh Refuya is a F, like the F in the English alphabet. And this too is known and pronounced correctly by all parts of the Jewish people, and therefore is not necessary to elaborate, and we shall continue. The next letter, after the Peh, is the Ssadi. The Ssadi is a letter which is definitely unfamiliar to many Jews nowadays. It is not a Ssadi, a Ts sound, a Ts being a combination of a T and an S. We have already pointed out that Rabbi Ssadi Gaon, in his Perush, in his commentary on Sefer Yisirah, writes that in Hebrew we have pure consonants which are not the result of a combination of consonantal sounds. A Ts is exactly such a combination of 2 consonantal sounds. And an interesting piece of information I can mention here, which not many people know, is the following: that in Tafresh Ayn Gimel, 1913, there was a body called the Va'ad, or the Wa'ad al-Lashon Ha'Ivrith, the Committee for the Hebrew Language. And this was in fact the forerunner of the body that exists today, an official body of the Israeli government, known as the Akademia al-Lashon Ha'Ivrith, the Academy for the Jewish Language. In that year, Tafresh Ayn Gimel, 1913, it was discussed. The question of pronunciation of certain letters was discussed, and many people would be surprised to be made aware of some of the discussions and some of the conclusions reached by that committee, which, by the way, was populated mainly by Ashkenazim. And amongst other things, they decided that the heth, as we've discussed before in the previous interview, the letter heth should be pronounced as a heth and not as a cheth. And the same goes, of course, for the ayn. But with regards to the Ssadi, the committee decided, and this is very unusual and very strange, but it is a fact, the committee decided that the Hebrew language is missing the consonant which is represented in German by the letter Z, the Ts sound. It is also a fact that many of the Jews on this committee who were Ashkenazim were German speakers and were obviously influenced by this fact. They felt, for whatever unusual and strange reason, that the letter Ts was missing from the Hebrew language and that should be adopted, the Ashkenazi pronunciation should be adopted as the correct pronunciation of this letter, despite the fact that they knew very well that this was not, as they admit, as one sees in the records of their discussions, they were fully aware that the correct pronunciation was the S, which is a deep guttural S sound, as pronounced by the Sephardim and the Temanim, and not the T of the Ashkenazim. Now, in order to explain how you pronounce this sound, which I understand for many is most unusual and certainly difficult at first, and I will also point out that, as with the Ayin, the Ssadi, the S sound, is a sound, a consonantal sound, which is certainly a very Semitic consonant, but again, in certain Far Eastern languages, such as Chinese, there is a S sound, a consonantal sound, which corresponds to the Ssadi. So it is, again, not as unusual as some people may imagine in terms of global human speech. It does not exist, this is true, in European languages, but it does exist in many other languages. There is a relationship between the letter Taith, the 9th letter of the alphabet, and the letter Ssadi. The connection being that both are pronounced by the tongue being raised towards the roof of the mouth, with the tongue touching the back, as it were, just behind the back of the front teeth, and at the same time a somewhat guttural sound is added or somehow connected to this sound, so that it's a kind of a t and a bit of an ayin together. In the case of the taith, and in the case of the Ssadi, it is a s with an ayin together. So you have taith and you have Ssadi, and these two letters are most definitely related and very similar in the way they are pronounced, in the way the mouth forms these sounds. And I'll give you a very simple example and proof of this fact. In Hebrew, we have reflexive verbs. That is to say, a person doing something to himself. For example, to get dressed. To get dressed in Hebrew is lehitlabesh in regular Israeli pronunciation, or a more correct pronunciation, lehitlabesh. And it's very important that we pronounce it correctly to understand the point that we're making now. In other words, the reflexive form of any verb is by taking the root of the verb. In the case of to dress, the root is lamed veth shin, lavash, and we add a hey and a tau in the front, to the front of that, and we have hith labish. And this is true for all verbs, or I should say almost all verbs. To give you another example, if one wants to cool off in Hebrew, one says lehith karer. The shoresh, the root of the verb is Kaph resh, which has to do with the concept of cold. Kar is cold. Karer is to make something cool, something else cool. The karer, and if one wishes to cool off oneself, for instance, if one's very hot and jumps into a pool of cold water, one does so in order to cool off. One says in Hebrew, lehith karer. This is true for almost all verbs in Hebrew, with the exception of verbs where part of the root of the verb consists or begins with the letter Ssadi. Let us take the example of the word to photograph. To photograph, to take a photograph in Hebrew is letzalem, in standard Hebrew pronunciation today, letzalem, based on the strange decision that Hebrew needs a consonant that it managed very nicely without for thousands of years. But pronounced more correctly, the verb to take a photograph is l'salem. L'salem, the shoresh, the root is Ssadi lamed mem. Now, therefore, it would follow, based on what we said before, that the reflexive form of that verb, to take a photograph of oneself or to allow oneself to be photographed by somebody else, would be lehit tzalem, if you were to pronounce it in standard Israeli pronunciation today, lehit tzalem, which of course is difficult to pronounce, or pronounced correctly would be lehith solem, which again is very difficult and very clumsy for pronunciation. And precisely for this reason, in the case of such verbs where the root begins with the letter Ssadi, as in salam, l'salem, instead of the two letters being added to form the reflexive form of the verb, and therefore saying lehith salem, we say instead of a tau we replace it with a taith, and we say you would think you would say lahit salem, but in fact even lahit salem, to say taith followed by Ssadi, is also difficult, somewhat difficult, and therefore in Hebrew we in this case reverse the order of these two letters. So instead of having the word lahit salem being written lamed hey taith in place of the tau, and then Ssadi lamed mem, so which would be lahit salem. Instead of saying that, we say lahis talem. We reverse the order, and we have Ssadi first, and the taith comes after it, immediately after. So we have lamed he Ssadi, and then taith. So the letter teth here, which is from the reflexive additional letter added to the verb to make the reflexive verb, the taith, which is in place of the tau, actually comes in the middle of the root. So the root, which is Ssadi lamed mem, is now broken up, and you have Ssadi taith lamed mem. So you have lahit salem. Why is this? Very simple. Because to say taith, to say Ssadi followed by taith is easy relative to trying to say, for example, lahith salem is very difficult. But to say lahis talem is easy because and I'm sure some of you are smiling to yourselves and you don't think it's very easy at all, but in fact, if, as with everything else, if one gets used to it and one hears these sounds and practices it, it is not difficult, because the s and the t are pronounced from the same part of the mouth and with the tongue in the same position. The difficulty in saying lahith salem is the fact that the tongue is in a very different position and has to shift from one mode to another. Where you say lahis talem, the Ssadi and the taith being pronounced in a very similar manner with the position of the tongue relative to the back of the teeth and the palate and the top of the roof of the mouth, etc. The pronunciation is therefore much more straightforward. And this is a rule which is correct for all verbs in Hebrew which begin, where the root begins with the letter Ssadi. And this is clear proof that the Ssadi and the taith are to be pronounced in this fashion. So, in summation, from Kaph, from the letter Kaph up to the letter Ssadi, we have 10 consonants, that is Kaph, Chaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ayin, Pe, Fe, and Ssadi. That's 10 consonants. And out of those 10, we have 2 that are frequently mispronounced, that is the Ayin, the letter Ayin, and the letter Ssadi. So that is 20% of those consonants which are frequently mispronounced.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.